Okay, I'm going to speak to you, and we're going to discuss holiness, the holiness of God in the sacrificial worship in Leviticus. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole book of Leviticus, but this is, by and large, an introduction to the book of Leviticus and to a whole sorely neglected part of the Old Testament and of Christian theology, and it's something that's missing sorely in churches, particularly in the West. I still remember when I was first asked by Concordia Publishing House about whether I would like to do a commentary for them, and I asked for a list of books which hadn't been taken, and prominent among them, where there was nobody put up their hands, was Leviticus. I wonder why. If ever there's a Cinderella book in the Old Testament and the Bible, this is it with spades. And I still remember the reaction of some good friends of mine when they asked about what I was doing, and they said I was working towards a commentary, and they pricked up their ears, and then they asked which book was I preparing a commentary. I said Leviticus. The face fell. The implication was that I couldn't get much more foolish than that. Doing a commentary on Leviticus is an exercise in foolishness, if not in stupidity. Now, why, and I want to be personal here because it might help you to edge in a way. Why did I choose to do a commentary on Leviticus? Well, it goes back a long way to my childhood. I grew up in the north end of the Barossa Valley, which is something like your Napa Valley in California, a wine-growing area. And it was one of the original areas of Lutheran settlement in Australia. We had religious refugees, not from Saxony, but from basically Silesia and what's now Poland, coming over and settling in Australia. And my home congregation, my home church, was one of the oldest churches in the Barossa Valley. I've had the privilege of travelling around here and seeing some of your old churches in this area, and it reminds me very much of the churches that the settlers built in Australia. Now, this church was part of my childhood. We lived in that area for the first 14 years of my life. I still have vivid memories of a number of things that made a deep, deep impression on me. Much deeper impression than all the instruction that I had in Sunday school, and then later on in Christian day school, that's a primary school, and anything I had subsequently. The thing that made the deepest impression on me was that this was a special place. It wasn't that it was particularly ornate, or as church architecture goes, it's your standard Lutheran church. Now you have the nave and then the sanctuary, but it had a very ornate altar, wooden altar. And on the altar you had in German, heilig, heilig, heilig. Holy, holy, holy. And somehow that gripped my imagination in many ways. Holy, holy, holy. And together with that, one of my favorite stories from the Old Testament was the call of Isaiah. Now that's where it comes from. Remember Isaiah the prophet? He's in the temple and he has a vision of the Lord high and lifted up, and the angels in God's presence singing, holy, holy, holy. The second thing that had a deep impact on me was the pastor that I had, first of all, when I was young, quite often would start the service before the invocation. He would say, he'd lift up his hands and he'd say, "The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit." The Lord is in his holy temple. I had the sense then, as a child, quite naturally, that when I came to church, I was sitting or standing on holy ground. And this came to a point of focus one Christmas Eve service, where we children were, and as I think you have the custom too, Christmas Eve service is a children's service. You have a Christmas pageant, and the children are involved in telling the Christmas story and singing carols. And we were in front of the church. There's a great big Christmas tree all lit up, and the whole church was sparkling with light and colour. And we stood in front of the tree, and we children sang the Paul Gerhardt hymn, "All my heart this night rejoices, as I hear far and near sweetest angel voices." And for me as a child, as we were singing that, it was as if heaven was opened and I heard the angels singing with us and us singing with the angels. Okay, childhood impression. That has never ever left me, although much of what's happened subsequently after that did its best to erase that sense of awe at standing in the presence of the triune God. The altar had three parts to it. It was the throne, three parts representing the three persons of the Trinity. And for many years, that kind of went, and gradually as I got older, went into the back of my memory and recessed there. Occasionally, the theme of God's holiness would re-emerge, and I still remember trying to get my head around it at seminary, and nobody really could give me a satisfactory account of what it meant that we said that God was holiness. What's God's holiness? What's its importance? And when I did dogmatics, we did third article, and we dealt with sanctification, but I found to my disappointment that it was all just about doing good works. It wasn't really much about holiness at all. From then onwards, my life has been a gradual rediscovery of the holiness of God. And I could write a whole book to give you all the detailed kind of steps along the way. But I will focus on just one incident. But before I come to it, it's quite obvious to me that when people open the book of Leviticus, they shut it as quickly as they open it. Even Christians who read the Bible from beginning to end sort of hit a roadblock when they come to Leviticus. You jump over it, you jump over Numbers, you might dip in and out of Numbers, but then you pick things up at the book of Deuteronomy. Okay, it's an alien book. And because it's an alien book, which if you like, gives us a window into an alien world, a world that's different from ours, it's very, very important to us. It shows us our spiritual deficiency, that we've lost something very important. And we've lost it to our detriment, and we would do good to regain it. Most people that I know who went to university, that's college like me, educated people, Christians even, but non-Christians as well, regard this as superstitious nonsense. Ritual mumbo-jumbo that has nothing whatsoever to give to us modern people. It's just irrelevant. So much so that some years ago, when did you have the Reader's Digest over here? Maybe you're not old enough. The Reader's Digest was a very popular magazine in the 50s and 60s. There was a little booklet that came out once a month and would do a digest of books and articles. So it would come out and I enjoyed it as a child because it was simple, plain English, and you got lots of good information. So they'd give a very short version or plot summary of classics like Gone with the Wind and that kind of stuff. They actually produced one version of a Reader's Digest version of the Bible. And guess what? Which book was completely absent? The book of Leviticus. That tells its story. Tells its story. For me, in my own journey, things came to a head when I visited New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, up north of Australia for the first time. I was in Lae, where a former student of mine who had done Hebrew with me at the seminary before going across to the US here, where he'd got I think it was a master's degree in Old Testament. So he came to do Hebrew before he went over there. And I was visiting the country, and I met up with him and visited with him in Lae fairly soon after he'd come back from the US. He was being prepared to teach in one of the four seminaries up in the country, Lutheran seminaries. By the way, there's a very big Lutheran church there. And I asked him then how things had gone when he was in the US. He said, the people were very kind. And how did his studies go? How did his theological studies go? And I could see him thinking to himself. He paused a long time. He paused far too long. And then he said, John, for them nothing is sacred any longer. Now that really touched me to the quick, because what he said about Lutherans, this is not other people, Lutherans in North America, he could have said about me, and what had been happening in my church, what had been happening in my lifetime. We live in a world where nothing is sacred any longer. Now, by we living in a world, I don't mean everybody does, but we Westerners, we people who live in Europe and North America and Australia, Western countries, for us, nothing is sacred any longer. And that's been a gradual story, a gradual unfolding, beginning with the Renaissance, going to the Enlightenment, going to the Great Revolutions, and coming to a head last century with the Communist Revolution. And after that, then you have the post-communist consumer societies everywhere in the West. For us, in our societies, nothing is sacred anymore. And it's not just out there in the world, but the sad story is for us as Christians. For most denominations, say in North America, nothing is sacred any longer. What's going on? What's happened? And yet, paradoxically, there's a deep longing for something sacred. And the secular world has picked up the language of holiness when the church has junked the language of holiness. So what's very fashionable in Australia is to be interested in Aboriginality. They're the original people that lived in Australia, and their whole way of life focuses around sacred places, is inherent to their culture. And so coming from Aboriginal, the influence of Aboriginal thinking on us, so a lot of secular people talk about sacred places, but not in a sense that we identify. For us, nothing is sacred any longer. There's been a loss of the sense of sacredness gradually for the last 500 years. That's one part of the story. And I don't want to analyse the reasons for this. You probably know your history well enough to be able to map out that gradual process, both in the world and in the church. However, that's not so everywhere in the world. Go to Africa, go to Asia, and it's still alive and well there, everywhere. The animist societies in Africa, Islam across the Middle East, you can't understand Islam and its appeal unless you see that holiness is right at the center of it, the holiness of Allah. Hinduism, Buddhism, all have a sense of holiness in a different way than we do, but you won't make sense of those religions in Western terms unless you start from the point of view of holiness. Strangely and paradoxically, and it's interesting how things happen in human history, when the church kicks stuff out because it's no longer relevant, guess who discovers these things? It's secular society. Somewhere along the line, I'd like to do it if I had time, but I'll never do it. I'd like to do a history of this in the last 200 years, how the church has always been behind the 8 ball. It thinks it's following society, but in fact it's usually 50 years behind what's happening out there. Now, one of the strangest phenomena for me, ever since I've studied this topic, is the modern obsession with purity and pollution. Now, pollution, there's an in word. I would recommend to you, if you want to understand so much that's going on in your society and most of the world, to read a wonderful book by Mary Douglas called Purity and Danger. Purity and Danger. I've given the reference to that at the end of the handout. Purity and Danger. She's not a theologian, she's a cultural anthropologist. A cultural anthropologist is a person who studies societies and what makes societies work. So she did her basic work in Africa, in present-day Sudan, amongst some of the Nuer tribe, I think it was, in Africa. And it wasn't long before she cottoned on to the fact that if she was going to make sense of the way they lived, the way they thought, the way they acted, the way they organised their society, she had to come to grips with the distinction between clean and unclean. Clean and unclean. And she did it in that society, and then she did the same in many other cultures. And to her astonishment, she basically claims, and with good evidence, that this is one of the most fundamental human categories that lies behind the organisation of any society. All societies, in some way or other, think in terms of clean and unclean, and she reflected a great deal on it and said that it's something that's inbuilt to us because we are embodied, we live in bodies. And we have a sense of things coming from outside of our bodies into our bodies, and things coming out of our bodies into the world around us. And there is a sense that we have a fear of being dirty, polluted, defiled in some way, and that's visceral. It's not just that you're physically unclean, but it touches the very soul of people, the sense of being unclean. Hence, in the West, we have the strange phenomena of taking baths or showers at least once a day, if not twice a day, and compulsively washing ourselves much more than we ever need to. You don't need to have a shower every day. However, if I didn't have a shower every day, I would feel yuck. So it comes to us with our sense of embodiment What's unclean is outside of us. We need to create a clean space around us for us to be happy and to live ordered, healthy human lives. So purity and health somehow, and physical health are somehow connected. Infection comes from outside, various sources to us, but the most dangerous forms of infection are through the nose and mouth, but then also through the genitals. Right? They are sources of infection, sources of impurity. Now, after reading her, in a sense, there was a whole lot of ahas for me. All of a sudden, stuff began to make sense. Not only about the Bible, but also about my own experience of life. Why I am the way I am, why I feel about things the way I do. What became evident then to me is that it's not just for the last 200 years, but in the last 200 years, the category of purity and pollution has come right into the center of Western culture. So you get a funny phenomenon. At the same time as our culture has become desacralized, we've lost our sense of holiness, what's come into its place is an obsession with, not purity so much as an obsession with pollution. Pollution. You won't understand lots of things that have happened the last 200 years unless you see the power of that. Now, pollution at the simplest level is being clean or being dirty. Now, strictly speaking, dirt is not unclean. There's only some kinds of dirt that are unclean, but that's the picture we have. Okay? There's clean, and then there's dirt, and we don't want to be polluted. In the early 1800s, scientists had discovered for the first time the reason for infection, and they postulated germ theory. Now, that sat around for a while and really didn't take off. People had great difficulty understanding infections in the sense of germs, until somebody, and we don't know who it was, began to speak about germs as being what? Dirty, unclean, and connecting that with sanitation. And you realize just that simple connection of germ theory, that germs attack us and they damage our bodies, they pollute our bodies. Well, even pollute is, they don't pollute, they just attack our bodies. But if you call that pollution, and health is then, if sickness is pollution, what is health? It's purity. Or purity is health. Now, that simple metaphor, that picture, that model has done more to save millions of people's lives, has done more to promote good health all around the world than any other single factor. It sells itself once you make that connection. Do you understand what I'm saying? So you have this picture, and it's basically a picture, and you say, okay, being healthy is being what? Clean, and being sick is being dirty in a way, polluted by germs. Two other very powerful movements last century, I could go on and give many examples, but I just want to pick the most powerful of these. The kind of ideas of that Hitler promoted were floating around in Europe for about 200 or 300 ideas. The idea of, particularly once you got genetics and you had superior races, inferior races. In fact, that's as old as human history. You get superior races, inferior races. And the idea, for example, that Westerners were superior to black people goes back hundreds of years. Now, what was it that Hitler and the people around Hitler did? that was so powerful and so successful that they managed to take captive one of the most sophisticated intellectual societies in the world, which was modern Germany. What did Hitler say the Jews were? Unclean. And Aryans were clean. And the rest is history. Just by making that connection sells itself, showing how deep this is, this distinction is, and how powerfully it touches human beings. Thirdly, one of the most powerful movements that I've seen happen in my lifetime is the ecological movement. It is the basic secular religion, in case you don't realize it. Everywhere in the Western world, it is the dominant paradigm, and it's not just a scientific paradigm, a social paradigm, a political paradigm, but it is a quasi-religious paradigm. It's as close as we have to a universal Western religion, the ecology movement. Now, how did it start? Okay, the scientists, particularly biologists and botanists, discovered, the more study they did about what is now called the web of life, how intricate the whole order of living creatures is on the earth, and the delicate balances between all the various parts of the created world, and particularly the living part of the world. And they realized that if you disrupt some part of that web of life, it doesn't stop there, but it damages the whole web of life. Now, all of you have done enough science to know that basic teaching. Now, basically, the understanding of that sat around for quite a long time until, and we don't know who did it, all of a sudden, scientists began to speak about ecological disorder as what? Pollution. Pollution. And that's taken off. Do you realize carbon doesn't actually pollute? That's a picture. And it's not a terrible accurate picture. But if I said that out there, I would be drummed out of the USA as an ignorant obscurantist. So you have order. There's ecological order is purity. So we speak about a clean green, clean energy. Everything's clean food, clean everything. Just think of diet. Everybody's into clean food, healthy lifestyle, clean lifestyle. The opposite is dirty, polluted. So it's there all around us. Why aren't we using that in our mission to our ecologically minded young people? And most young people have had this drummed into them. It's their automatic default way of thinking. So even though the church basically makes little use of the terms clean and unclean where it belongs, the world has picked it up and run with it and done very powerful things with it. Clean, unclean. So I still remember talking to one of my best friends who is a headmaster of a school, a very well-educated man who when we got discussing about what I was doing in Leviticus, he says, gosh, that's rather primitive, isn't it? That's rather irrelevant. And I said, what? He says, all that bloody business and all this obsession about, menstruation being unclean and all that stuff about impurity. And I listened to him and I gave him a little bit of Mary Douglas and some lights went on his mind, and then he himself confessed to me that he himself had found that he was never able to make love to his wife while she was menstruating. He knew that there was no medical reason not to do it, but there was something in him, an aversion in him, that made it impossible. Or even he found strange his own behaviour, that he found it impossible to make love to his wife when she was pregnant. Okay? On the one hand, he rejects this. On the other hand, it governs him. And the same time, when we got talking about it, I said, well, look, we don't really need to clean our teeth, but unless I clean my teeth every morning and every night, I feel yuck. My whole day is out of kilter. And he confessed that he had to do it 3 times a day. Okay, now, so loss of holiness in our Western society. On the other hand, out there's been a rediscovery of purity and impurity. Leviticus is rejected because it's all about holiness. The other thing that reason why Leviticus is rejected is that it's full of this obscure ritual mumbo-jumbo. Since the Enlightenment, our Western cultures have developed a blind spot to ritual. We have the illusion that we do things the right way, and this is the way, it's just the natural way. Other people are involved in ritual, without realizing that our whole life is shot through and through with ritual at every level, from the political through to the spiritual. Everywhere you come across ritual. In fact, we are engaged in a ritual here and now. You could analyze ritual. So you get the funny contradiction. On the one hand, people reject ritual in the church, or they believe they do, and they embrace ritual where? Out there in the world. Just think of sports. Sport is a form of ritual. Politics is largely ritual activity. It's everywhere out there. Daily life is ritualized. You get up at a certain time, you have a routine in the morning, meals are family rituals. Everywhere you look, you have ritual, and yet we have a contempt for it. Now, that's very, very powerful in the West, and it's worst of all here in North America. Because you have the illusion amongst particularly Protestant churches that they don't do ritual. You've got to be kidding. Every church does ritual, even if they don't realize what they're doing is ritual. And it's fundamental, basic to our Christian life. Okay, I'll just pause there. They are general sort of observations before I'm homing in on the topic. Any observations, questions? Yes?
I got one. Do you think the obsession with cleanliness is being overdone in our world? Because this comes back to, part of my background is I'm a farmer. And I grew up among animals and got dirty a lot. And my parents had friends that were suburbanites. They kept their kids very clean, and they were constantly getting sick. And my kids don't, my grandkids don't. And where's this fit in this paradigm?
Okay. This is part of the problem, is that we want to protect our children and ourselves so much against this dirty world out there that in fact we're making them more and more vulnerable. Now, there's good medical evidence, and what you're talking about now is not just a vague impression, but there's hard and fast medical thing. One of the strangest things is the increase of allergies. Allergies, and it's gone through the ceiling. Allergies that were never here 50 years ago are everywhere. So I find it very interesting. And it doesn't happen in Australia, but here, whenever I come to North America, people ask me, do I have any food needs? Meaning, am I allergic to any particular kinds of food? And I hasten to reassure them that I'm omnivorous, as well as carnivorous, and oinivorous, which is wine devouring. What they point out is that it's necessary for children not only to be exposed to dirt, actual physical dirt. Sometimes you find your children eating dirt. That's very important, that they're exposed to dirt, but they're exposed to animals. And by being exposed to animals, they develop immunity against various forms of what then emerge as allergies. So what medical practitioners are now advocating for young children is that you don't mollycoddle them, and in fact you have some animals, and the animals are good for their physical health. Now there's lots of other data like this saying that our obsession with it's misplaced. Our so-called obsession with purity is the wrong kind of purity, and it's in fact making us less healthy, it's making us sick. So we're becoming sick from our obsession with purity. Now there's a whole lot of research done on this, and it's very, very reliable, I'm given to understand. Yes, Jeff?
I heard a sermon a couple of years ago, and it's really stuck with me because the whole point was fear drives everything in our lives. And I hear that in everything you're saying here. And it actually, to me, I think it goes right back to the Garden of Eden in the fall. That which is clean is coming through the garden after the fall, and they're hiding themselves. They're naked and afraid and ashamed. And the sense of the loss of perfect love is behind it. And, but the more I've thought about this, you can almost interpret anything that anybody's doing is in that sense of fear.
Yes. And we're hiding, our whole society is in a sense hiding behind fig leaves. They're not very effective in protecting against the nasty things out there, because as Jesus said, where does pollution ultimately come from? Not from out there, but from the heart. Okay, yes?
You have mentioned the Enlightenment as a big transition time, and I've read that the philosophers hated original sin, the doctrine of original sin, more than any other Christian doctrine.
And they hated ritual with almost as much hatred.
So that, because you have to, you are good, and your reason is good, and it's reliable, therefore, and so it's all the ritual that comes out after that is trying to fix stuff, but it doesn't get fixed.
It doesn't get fixed, and the Enlightenment is shot through and through with contradictions, because they regarded human beings as basically good. Human beings were clean, and the part of the human being that was most clean was their mind, pure reason. And reason was being contaminated with superstition. Christianity, all religion is superstition. That's the source of the troubles in the world. And so Immanuel Kant, who is the great philosopher of the Enlightenment, wrote his most influential work, which is deals with pure reason. Notice the term pure. Pure for him was reason which was somehow got rid of this thing, the body. The Enlightenment has a contempt for physical things in the body ultimately too. And you can see it in Immanuel Kant. He was a crusty old bachelor, a cold fish who ran his life like clockwork, so much so he lived in Königsberg that people could set their watches to the minute by his daily walks around town. So he was like a clockwork machine in his habitual way of doing it. Yeah. Another story. I don't want to go any further down that road. Yeah. The Enlightenment did so much to destroy the sense of what's holy, but also to completely reconfigure our understanding of clean and unclean that we're still living with today. Yes?
I'd just like to validate what you said about the shower. In my previous life,
This is reincarnation, is it?
I was the product manager for showers for the Kohler Company, and I organized and led focus groups around the country, interviewing people about their emotional relationship to showers, so that it could guide our product development discussions and, of course, our advertising. And it really is fascinating, and I very much, of course, for commercial purposes, wanted to learn about this and play on this, that the really strong emotional connection that people have to their showers in this country. And, you know, this is big business for the Kohler Company. The bathroom is the sort of the inner sanctum of the house.
It is. It's the clean place.
And people spend an enormous amount of money on it. And it really, I mean, I could go on and on about the research, but it also, of course, powerfully connects to that baptismal regeneration that we have need of every day. And not only is there, you know, you expressed it as a yuck, but there's that sense of that need to reset, to begin again, that people miss if they have to rush and miss out on their shower.
Because there's a close connection between purity and order and pollution and disorder. At every level, from the most physical through to the spiritual. And what you're referring to is a billion-dollar industry. I mean, there's a lot of money to be made in locking into this, all over, not just for cleansing products and bath products, but through diet and everything now. Just think of how much people spend on, clean food, so-called clean food. Organically certified. Now, all food is organic, you've got to be kidding. But that's another story. Okay, let's go on. Yes, let's look. Yeah.
Comment on ritual. You know, we have people say, oh, I like liturgy, it's just ritual.
Yes.
And the same people, like you said before, sports, they're huge sports fans.
Yes.
But just take a baseball game. The ritual involved even before the game starts.
Yes.
The presenting the scorecard, the batting order, the national anthem, the first pitch, the seventh inning stretch. It's all ritualized.
Yeah. And it's nothing but ritual.
Yeah.
It's what purpose does it serve? It's some ritual enactment. It's an elaborate ritual. You know, the scarves, the T-shirts, from beginning to end, it's ritual behaviour. It's very profound, and it serves. Don't knock it. It serves a very profound function in your society, and in Australia too. If we wouldn't have sport, one of the things that holds our society together would be removed, and society would even fall apart more than it is falling apart. Can I throw just one thing in connection with this? Somebody like Mary Douglas, and it's not coming from the church, and it should have come from the church, observes the following. She says, there's a close connection between ritual and community. Ritual creates community, and you either have good ritual or you have bad ritual, but you can have no ritual. The best way to destroy a community is to destroy its rituals or pervert its rituals. Where the ritual goes, community goes. Ritual creates, upholds, sustains community, and it sustains people within community. So we pastors are, from a secular point of view, basically ritual leaders. That's our function sociologically, and that's right. We lead communities, we build up communities by ritual means. Now, we don't just do it through secular ritual means, but through the best ritual means of all, which is holy ritual means. Come back to that in due course. Okay, the book of Leviticus, okay.
One thing that's kind of occurred to me lately, you were talking about the stepping away from the holiness, at least in regards to the things of the church.
Yes.
But at least in the 20th century, it seems to me there was a lot of redirecting that sense of holiness away from the church to the state.
Yes.
whether it's the blatant state worship of communism
Or
the idolatry of welfare
of
state.
Hitlerism.
Yeah, either of Hitlerism or communism, or else the modern welfare state.
Yeah, it strikes me as an Australian coming to North America of how much you Americans don't separate church and state. And how how basically your whole political system is theologized. Now, I saw it at a distance with the first campaign to bring Obama in. Basically, that whole campaign was messianic. Exactly the same sort of movement that brought Hitler to power, which is a messianic, and that swept in the French Revolution, sort of secular messianism. And what you're doing here is trying to establish the city set on a hill, New Jerusalem, American exceptionalism. There's all that kind of stuff, which is sheer illusion, but it's trying to sacralize. So you get a funny balancing act. The church desacralizes itself, then what happens? Politics sacralizes itself. The church gets rid of the whole notion of purity in the right sense, the right configuration of purity. Where does it appear then? In society. And it then isn't, it's instead of being healthy, used in a healthy way, those distinctions, then in society it's used in a neurotic way. Take, for example, this business of allergies. Yes. Yes?
I keep coming back to Matthew 12, where the demon goes out from the person and wanders around, comes back in, finds the house empty, comes in with 7 demons. Nature abhors a vacuum.
Yep.
And with the vacuum that Christianity filled, when that goes away, everything you're saying is people are finding the things that Christianity used to give them to fill the vacuum, and that is of the devil answering the same needs that they have.
And what they look for then is these things from idols rather than the living God. Yes, nature abhors the vacuum. It's just you mentioned there that wonderful story about the driving out one demon and 7 other demons. Do you realize the New Testament, despite our translations, the normal term for demons is unclean spirits? You won't understand Satan and the demons and the whole business of spiritual warfare unless you have a very clear sense of common and holy, clean and unclean. So holiness and impurity is essential if you're going to make any sense of the way Satan is at work in our world and in the church, and how to deal with Satan and the evil spirits. Okay? And that's one of the reasons that I am happy to take this seminar, because if we maybe 7 demons, maybe in our society there's more than 7 demons, but 7 times 7 demons are beginning to come back into the place which was once occupied by Christ in people's hearts and souls. And unless we have the right tools, we won't be able to see it and we won't be able to deal with it. Let me go on. You'll have a chance to bring in. I can see that, I hope this makes sense, because just to open it up, what it looks like, for me, what looked like an alien world initially, then once I came into it, guess what happened again and again? I said, aha, this makes sense of that. That's why this, that's why that, all over the place. Oh, that makes sense of this story in the New Testament. This makes sense of what Paul's talking here. This makes sense of the book of Revelation. All of a sudden, all over the place, windows started opening, and I made sense of stuff which before then I'd never made any sense. Now, the use of the book of Leviticus, once again, we have a rather ironical state of affairs. As I said, when the Reader's Digest, middle of last century, did its version of the Bible, it left out Leviticus altogether. But let's not be too hard on the Reader's Digest. when the people who drew up the 3-year lectionary, ostensibly to bring more of the scriptures into the life of the church, guess which book was overlooked almost entirely? The book of Leviticus. There's only, and if you know the way the 3-year lectionary works, particularly with the Old Testament, in the post-Pentecost you have not one Old Testament reading, but you always have 2 tracking to cover more of the Old Testament. So there's plenty of room there to bring in slabs of the Old Testament. There's only one set reading from Leviticus in that whole lectionary. And interestingly, it's from Leviticus 19, which at least is right for verse 1, but basically loving your neighbour as yourself. It picks that out of context and where it won't make sense. Okay, it's not there in this lengthy, compendious set of readings. On the other hand, if you go to our Jewish brothers and sisters, guess which book is read more than any other? It's the book of Leviticus. For any Jew, as you know, for Jews, the Old Testament is divided into 3 parts. The core of it is the Torah, the law of Moses. Then there are the prophets, and that includes the historical books, and then there are the writings. They're sort of 3 concentric circles of holiness. The most holy part of the Bible is the Torah, next most holy part is the prophets, and then you have the writings. So for Jews, the most important reading every Sabbath day is the Torah reading. The other ones are merely incidental. The Torah readings are the most important. Now, for Jews, the book of Leviticus is the center of the Bible. Make sense? So it's the center of the Bible. In fact, the Jewish scribes do an exercise in which they count all the letters in the Pentateuch, and the middle of the Pentateuch is right there in the middle of Leviticus. It's the center of the Hebrew Bible. I don't know if any of you have tried to get your head around present-day Judaism. Look, it's very important for you because of the influence of it here in North America, and to understand what makes them tick, what we have in common, where we differ. There's a lot that's very, very important for you to get your heads around, but I don't know if any of you have ever tried to find your way around the Mishnah, which is the Jewish commentary on the Pentateuch, and then the Talmud, which is the commentary on the commentary. Huge volumes like that. Now, all of it has to do with clean, unclean, holy, common. Most of it, in fact, is commentary on the book of Leviticus, which shows what? That for them, this is the most important book of the Bible. If you like, Leviticus is there for Christians with the Gospels, but we don't single out any one of the Gospels, any one of the 4 Gospels, but they single out Leviticus as the heart of the matter. You won't understand them unless you know why Leviticus is so important to them, what practical function it serves. Now, it's not just for the Jews that this is important. At the same time that I was going on this journey, which is, if you like, a rediscovery of the whole power of impurity and impurity and the power of holiness, that journey that I was traveling coincided with my exposure to Christians and other people in animist societies. It began with our Australian Aborigines. Basically, their culture is animist. And then up in New Guinea, huge Lutheran church, 1 million, maybe 1.5 million Lutherans in New Guinea, animists. Christians in Indonesia, another big Lutheran church. Christians in Malaysia, basically Indian background, Tamil Indians settling there. Going to India, another basically animist society. And then more recently, going across to Africa, where all Christians are former animists. Now, I'll make a big statement, which I won't defend and I won't develop at this stage. The Old Testament, and particularly the book of Leviticus, basically connects with people in an animist society. It takes what's valid in animism and corrects it. So you won't understand many things in Leviticus unless you see that the laws here are over against animism. Now, if that's the case, guess which part of the Bible should have been used most of all in doing mission work with animist people? The book of Leviticus. But you know what the story? I mean, we've had great missionary work done with all these people, and many of them are Lutherans, let alone Christians. The church is growing like wildfire in Africa with animist people. Which book of the Bible was not used at all? Leviticus. And so you get all sorts of weird sects in Africa that pick it up because the churches have never picked it up. Now, if we had any sense, this should have been one of the first books to be translated and used on the mission field. Now, okay, and so it's my conviction that Leviticus is going to be useful for us, not only in our mission to animist people, that's tribal people around the world, and there's still a lot of work to be done there, but also, and here's the surprise for me, with Muslims. Muslims. Do you realize what's happening in Islam? Not what's out there in public, but inside Islam. Do you realize there have been more converts from Christianity, Islam to Christianity the last 10 years than the whole of church history? Do you realize that Islam's rotting away from the inside? And that amongst young people there's an enormous appeal of Christianity? Now, you won't be able to minister to those people with your secularized theology that's being taught here in North America and in Germany. You won't be able to minister to them, evangelize them, except by a thoroughly consistent theology of holiness and purity. And the same applies for Buddhists. The whole of Buddhist thinking is basically based around clean and unclean, purity and impurity. And so too, supremely for Hindus. You won't understand Hinduism unless you see the whole of the Hindu complex system is based on a whole hierarchy of clean, unclean, from the bottom right up to the very top. And all Hindu theology focuses around these issues. So one of the reasons that I wrote the commentary was to help pastors, missionaries, particularly Lutheran pastors and missionaries in the Third World, Africa, Asia. I didn't expect it to get much of a hearing here in North America, let alone Australia, but I hope that I might be able to provide good resources for missionaries and the churches in these parts of the world. Now, one strange thing is that with the new situation we're in of globalization, we don't have to go out there to find animists, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists. Where are they? Right here. Why is God bringing these people into Christian North America? Now, the glib answer might be so that we can evangelize them, but I think the more profound reason is that these people have something to teach us. What do they have to teach us? They have to teach us what we've lost. The power of God's holiness and the power of purity. The importance of holiness and purity, not just for mission work, but for our own lives and for the life and future of the church in the Western world. Unless we recover that, from a human point of view, there's no future for the church in North America. At least that's my conviction. Okay, now, yes, questions. I've got a couple of minutes and then we have a break. Yes. What's it? 1:15, isn't it? Yes.
More about the rotting out of Islam from the inside out. That's the first time I've heard something like that.
Oh, I could speak hours on that. Yeah, now, what the West sees is the fanatical Islam and Muslims, ISIS now in Syria and in Iraq, okay? That hits the front every page. You Americans had lost the Trade Center. That's seared in your consciousness. So that face of Islam is in public view. However, when you go in any of the Muslim countries and you find out that the young, basically, just as communism rotted because it lost its youth, young people were basically had no interest in communism and rejected it. Not ideologically, but kind of viscerally. They knew it was, to put it in Australian terms, crap, and they wanted to have nothing to do with it. Crap kind of a nose. This is bad, it's unclean. It rotted from the inside, and so when your President Reagan basically did a bit of push to the wall, it all fell down and the societies clapped because it had rotted from inside. Now, something similar to that seems to be happening in many parts of the Islamic world. Just imagine you as a young woman growing up in an Islamic society and you are educated. How would you view the way the society treats you? How would you view the way your husband treats you? And then you get exposed to Western world, and even where things are bad here, but do you realize that most Islamic women, when they come to the West, are completely bamboozled by the way we treat women? Secondly, they're bamboozled because the fact that in Islamic societies, if you do the dirty on somebody, you do something wrong, what can you expect? Revenge. And if not immediately, if not in a subtle way, it's because it's a law society that focuses on the law of Allah, the judgment of Allah, the justice of Allah. It's a society that majors in revenge. So for these young people, guess what's very attractive? Is the whole notion of forgiveness. I could tell you a number of very interesting stories on that, but that leads us beyond the break. It means then, and this is also not very much publicized, that the leaders in Islam are worried because they're losing their youth. And you go to these countries where Christians are minority, and if you read the local papers, the rhetoric is there as if Christians are about to do what? Take over. And they're afraid of us. They're afraid of Christians. And there's a whole reform movement going in Islam that we don't hear much about, which is trying to make Islam more palatable to its young people. But watch that space. You might have to do a bit of searching of that, because people involved in it don't want to put it too much out in the public domain. Can you work out why?
Getting killed.
No, you won't get them killed, not here in the West. You know, I could put it out here in Australia, North America, but I'd create trouble where? Back in Indonesia and places like that. Because they are shame societies, not guilt societies, as long as they don't lose face, they can pretend it's not happening. But as soon as it gets to the media, and particularly the Western media, what do they have to do? They have to clamp down on it. So it's almost impossible to get accurate statistics about just even the conversions of Muslims to Christianity in that country. There's, at the same time, there's many, many hidden Christians everywhere in the Islamic world, supremely in Indonesia, and to some extent in Iran, from what I can gather. Yes?
With that being on the other side of that, because of the lack of holiness in and the lack of our culture rotting,
Yes.
is that why the Muslim faith is growing so fast?
Okay, because what's the basic message that, and very powerful, both gospel and also apologetic. And I heard it when I was in Africa, but also then very publicly in Africa. The Muslim people say that Christians are sacrilegious and immoral. Sacrilegious and immoral. So they're unholy and unclean. Why? Because they ordain practicing homosexuals. So the sanctioning of homosexuality is doing the cause of the gospel church irreparable harm in Africa, but also in Asia. There you have it in a nutshell.